Hey guys, welcome to Proactive Prudence, and in this video we'll be studying about physiology, which contains the second part of physiology, that is transport across cell membrane. So what is transport across cell membrane? It is the movement that occurs inside the cell and to the exterior of the cell through a membrane called cell membrane, which acts as a barrier between extracellular and intracellular components. So before going into transport across cell membrane, I want you guys to subscribe to the channel so that you get the update of new videos that I'll be uploading in future. In future. So yeah, shall we move to the next part of the video, which is introduction. So this is a introductory part of what is transportation across the plasma membrane. So the plasma membrane is a selectively permeable barrier between the cell and the extracellular environment. So plasma membrane is a selectively permeable barrier. So what is selectively permeable barrier? It it allows only selected particles inside to the cell. So it is called as selectively, and permeable is which allows inside through the barrier. Through the barrier is called as permeable membrane, permeable barrier. So plasma membrane is a selectively permeable barrier between the cell and the extracellular environment, and its permeability properties ensure that the essential molecules, these properties involve those functions which allow only few molecules such as glucose, which is very important for the cell to conduct energy inside it, and amino acids and lipids, which readily enter the cell, and metabolic intermediates remain in the cell. That is, metabolic intermediates is nothing but like ATP or any other metabolites that are synthesized during reaction of these amino acids, glucose and lipids. And sometimes these waste products are being formed in the cell, which is sent out through the permeable barrier, through the plasma membrane. So this is called as permeability properties of the cell. Moving on, they have told that the plasma membranes are selectively permeable. They allow only certain substances to pass through it. It doesn't allow all the substance to pass through the cell. It allows only which is required for the cell and important for the cell growth and division of it. So selectively permeable or semi-permeable. What is the meaning of selectively permeable or the semi-permeable? Is only certain substances which are able to pass through the membrane is called as selectively permeable. Then moving on, if the membranes were to lose this selectivity, the cell would no longer be able to maintain homeostasis or to sustain itself, and it would be destroyed. So homeostasis is nothing but it's a self-regulatory process by the cell while maintaining its stability. So how does it maintain stability? By adjusting to the surrounding environment so that it can survive to the utmost, to its best. That is called as homeostasis. So if the membrane loses its selectivity, then it will not be able to survive in that environment. So it shouldn't take up all the possible things that is around it. So it has to use a selective products which is helpful for the cell to survive and sustain itself. So that is called as selectively permeable. Then, in moving on, so there are different types of transport processes that happens inside a cell. So transport processes can be divided mainly into two types based upon the energy that is required to transport across the cell membrane. So it is one is active transport and the other one is passive transport. So what is active transport? It is the transporting of substances across the plasma membrane. It requires the energy to transport these substances. So that is called as active transport. And now there is another type of transport process, which is passive transport. If molecules can pass through the plasma membrane without using energy, these molecules are using passive transport. So when there is no use of energy by the molecules for the molecules to pass through the plasma membrane, it is called as passive transport. It is as simple as the names are being told, as active and passive. Moving on, what is passive transport and what are the important things that we have to study in a passive transport? I've put an image, just read it, we'll read it. So passive transport requires no energy and the molecule flow across the membrane by diffusion. There is no ATP required. So what is ATP? It is adenosine triphosphate, or the energy molecule. So passive transport, the substance is moved down its concentration or electric gradient to cross the membrane using its own kinetic energy. So passive transport is moving from the movement of substances across its concentration or the electrical gradient. Concentration is referred to the higher or lower concentrations, that is the amount of the substance that is being present. Electrical gradient is the ions that is being present. Electronic gradient is the differentiation from higher ion concentration to lower ion concentration, that is called as electric gradient. Then the next point is kinetic energy is intrinsic to the particles that are moving. So kinetic energy is nothing but the energy required for the movement. So this kinetic energy is intrinsic. Intrinsic is inside the particle that are moving. So this energy that is required for movement is involved inside the particle that is being moving from extracellular to the intercellular space. Moving on to the third point, no input of energy from the cell. There is no much input of the energy by the cell. There is no much energy that is being spent by the cell for passive transport. So these are the important points under passive transport. So this passive transport can be further divided into three types, which are diffusion, osmosis, and filtration. So what is diffusion? Diffusion is a passive process of transport. A single substance tends to move from an area of higher concentration to an area of lower concentration until the concentration is equal across the space. So this line says that the one single substance that moves from the higher concentration to the lower concentration, so that you attain an equal concentration across the space. So that is called as diffusion. Moving on, these materials that move within the cell cytol by diffusion, and certain materials move through the plasma membrane by diffusion. There are many materials which move around within the cytosol by diffusion. So there, moving on, this diffusion does not need any energy for movement of the particles. On contrary, the concentration gradient are a form of potential energy dissipated as gradient is eliminated. So this diffusion is a form of potential energy. Potential is stored energy. So this concentration gradient, that is higher concentration and lower concentration gradient, is a form of stored energy. So this concentration gradient is eliminated by diffusion. Moving to the next part, within a system, there will be different rates of diffusion of different substances in the medium. That is, inside the system itself, that is inside the cells only, there are different rates of diffusion that happens with different substances. Different rates is different speed of diffusion between different substances, different types of substances. Okay, so moving on, we have osmosis. I've put the picture along with the title of the each slide, so please refer the picture while you're reading out the points. Then moving on to osmosis. Osmosis is a special case of diffusion. Like water, like other substances, moves from an area of high concentration to one of low concentration. Most cell membranes are permeable to water, and since the diffusion of water plays such an important role in the biological function of any living being, a special term has been coined for it, which is osmosis. So osmosis is a special case of diffusion. It's not just a simple diffusion, but it is a special case of diffusion. It moves from it's similar to diffusion, that is moving from an area of higher concentration to one of the low concentration. So the net movement of solvent through the selectively permeable membrane. It is the net movement of solvent through a selectively permeable membrane. Uh, in living system, the solvent is water, which moves by osmosis across the plasma membrane from an area of higher concentration to the lower concentration. In other words, water moves through the selectively permeable membrane from an area of lower solute concentration to an area of higher solute concentration. Water molecules pass through a plasma membrane in two ways: by moving through the lipid bilayer and by moving through the aquaporins. So what is osmosis basically? You can see that there is an image. There is side A and side B. In side A, you have more of solute and less number of water. And in side B, there is no solute at all. There is only water, which is a solvent. So this osmotic pressure moves in such a way that the water moves into the solute to dilute it. So there is decrease in the concentration of solute on side A, and side B there is increasing of the solute. Solute is a substance. Okay, so they together balance in such a way that the solute and solvent are balanced, or the water moves inside where the solute is more and creates a dilution level. Uh, I hope you understood the concept of osmosis. So this osmosis takes place through two types of two ways in the plasma membrane. One is through the lipid bilayer, through the lipid phospholipid layer that is formed in the plasma membrane, or through the aquaporins. Aquaporins are integral membrane proteins that function as a water channels. So that is called as aquaporins. Then the last type which we have is filtration. This is the last form of plasma transport and is used most commonly in capillaries. So capillaries are so thin that their membranes are only one cell thick. The diffusion easily takes place through them. But remember that animals have a blood pressure. We have a blood pressure, and the pressure at which the blood flows through the capillaries is enough to push water and small solutes that have dissolved in water rightly through the capillary membrane. So in essence, the capillary membrane acts as a filter paper, allowing the fluids to surround the body cell and keeping large molecules from getting into the tissue fluid. See, I have put a picture of a renal corpuscle and the filtration membrane that is being present in the glomerular capillaries. So capillaries are so thin that they are all made up of only one cell thick. So in this one cell thick, there is blood pressure that is flowing inside. So while the pressure of the blood is moving, the water and the solutes that is present in the blood gets filtrated out into the glomerulus. So in this way the water moves out in the form of diffusion or the filtration. So this is called as filtration. I hope you understood. Moving to the next concept, which is active transport. We'll firstly see what the image tells. Active transport, it requires energy. Very importantly, it requires energy. The molecules are pumped across the membrane. These do not easily move through the cell membrane. They have certain special carrier proteins, so they are pumped across the cell membrane and they require ATP. So what is active transport? It is a movement through the cell membrane from a region of lower concentration to a region of higher concentration. Okay, the particles move against the concentration gradient using energy released during respiration. Please do keep in your mind that in passive transport, the movement is from higher concentration to lower concentration, but in active transport it is from lower concentration to higher concentration. That is opposite to the passive transport, and this transportation from lower to higher needs energy. So this energy is being released from respiration. Okay, moving to the next point. Sometimes dissolved molecules are at higher concentration inside the cell than the outside, but because the organism need these molecules, they still have to be absorbed. So in some cases, few molecules are being dissolved, are in dissolved state inside the cell, and they are at higher concentration. In spite of having at higher concentration, the organism will still more need some molecules that is required by the cell. So it pumps in few of the molecules which is required by the cell. So these while pumping the molecules, there are certain carrier proteins present in the cell membrane. So these carrier proteins pick up these specific molecules and take them through the cell membrane, which is against the concentration gradient. Please do note that there is against the concentration gradient, that is moving from lower to higher. So this active transport, it can be divided as primary active transport and secondary active transport. So the what is primary active transport? It is a direct active transport. It directly uses chemical energy such as ATP, in case of cell membrane, to transport all the species of solute across the membrane against their concentration gradient. It is said that the primary active transport is a direct form of active transport. So while doing the direct form of active transport, it requires some chemical energy, such as these ATPs. They require ATPs to transport the species or the solutes from the outer membrane to the inside of the cell using the ATP against the concentration gradient. The uptake of glucose in human intestine is an example, a classic example of primary active transport. There are other sources of energy for primary active transport. It is not just the ATP. There are other forms of it also, like redox energy and photon energy. So what is redox energy? It is the chemical reactions such as oxidation and reduction reactions that occur inside the intestine or any other part of the body, which takes up energy to conduct the primary active transport. Then what is photon energy? It is the light energy that is used to make the primary active transport a successful one. There is another example for primary active transport using redox reaction that is happening inside a mitochondrial ETC, that is electron transport chain, which uses reduction energy of NADH to move the protons across the inner mitochondrial membrane against their concentration gradient. For example, in mitochondria, there is something called as ETC, which is electron transport chain. This electron transport chain uses the reduction energy of NADH, which is nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide, which is at its reduced form. This is used for energy reduction to move the protons across. Protons is nothing but H plus. That is, this NADH is used to move from the inner mitochondrial membrane against the concentration gradient. Another example for primary active transport is using light energy by the protons involved in the photosynthesis. To read out the points, which these are the key points that are to be remembered in primary active transport. The sodium potassium pump moves K plus into the cell while moving Na plus at the ratio of 3 Na plus for every 2 K plus ion. When the sodium potassium potassium ATPase enzyme points into the cell, it has high affinity for sodium ion and binds 3 of them, hydrolyzing ATP and changing the shape. As the enzyme changes shape, it reorients itself towards the outside of the cell, and the 3 sodium ions are released. The enzyme's new shape allows 2 potassiums to bind and the phosphate group to detach, and the carrier protein deposits itself inside the interior of the cell. The enzyme changes shape again, releasing the potassium ions into the cell. After potassium is released into the cell, the enzyme binds 3 sodium ions, which starts the process over again. So this is the key points of primary active transport that you can use as an example to describe what is primary active transport. Moving to the next part, which is secondary active transport. The secondary active transport is nothing but the movement which takes place by downhill downhill in order to yield enough inotropic energy to drive the transport of other solute uphill. So it moves from downhill to the uphill using certain entropic energy. This is also called as coupled transport, as opposed to non-coupled or uniport transport, where transport of single component is facilitated. So in secondary active transport, there's take place a barter system, that is exchange of it. So when the molecule is moving inside, there must be something in exchange to the component that is moving in with the other component that moves out. So this is called as coupled transport. There are two main types of coupled transport, which is antiport and symport. This antiport is movement of two species or ions of or other solutes are pumped in opposite directions across a membrane. In symport, the transport occurs where two species move in the same direction. So this secondary active transport is movement of allowing one solute to move downhill and another solute moving uphill with the use of entropic energy to drive the transport. So this is called a coupled transport. Remember, secondary active transport is always called as coupled transport. And this coupled transport can be further divided into two types, which is antiport and symport. Antiport is two species of ions or other solutes that are being pumped in opposite directions and across the membrane. And in symport, transport occurs when two species move in the same direction. Moving to the key points of secondary active transport, the electrical and concentration gradient of membrane tends to drive sodium into and potassium out of the cell, and active transport works against these gradients. To move the substances against the concentration or the electrochemical gradient, the cell must utilize the energy in the form of ATP during active transport. Remember, these are the examples, they are not the actual points that you have to write under secondary transport. I have explained to you what secondary transport is. I want you guys to make the notes of secondary transport and not write down these points which I've used as an example to explain the secondary transport. So, primary active transport, which is directly dependent on ATP, moves ions across the membrane and creates a difference in the charge across that membrane. But secondary transport active transport created by primary active transport and is the transport of solute in the direction of its electrochemical gradient and does not directly require ATP. So secondary active transport requires electrochemical gradient and not the energy as such. And carrier proteins such as uniports, imports, and antiporters perform the primary active transport and facilitate the movement of solutes across the cell membrane. So this ends the transport of across the cell membrane. So this ends transport across cell membrane, and we'll be studying about different topics under cell membrane. The physiology in coming videos. So for now, this will end up with transport across cell membrane. Hope you like the video. Please do share it with your friends so that they also get to know what physiology is. So this video is purely based upon AHS syllabus, which is Allied Health Science and afflicted to Rajiv Gandhi University. So in the next class, I'll be uploading a video of homeostasis under physiology. Thank you.